From Afghanistan to South Sudan to Syria, aid groups that were once almost universally viewed as neutral increasingly find themselves targeted. Why the change? And what can be done to make things safer for aid agencies and the critical work they do? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. There was a time when aid groups working in difficult places were almost universally regarded as neutrals. In most conflicts, all sides respected them. And while aid might have been blocked from reaching particular areas, aid workers themselves were rarely attacked. But that era is long gone. In recent years, aid groups and their activities have frequently been targeted in conflicts around the world. Wednesday's attack on the Jalalabad office of Save the Children was only the latest example of what has become a disturbing trend. We begin with this report from Jennifer Glass.
The attack began with a car bomb at the door of the Save the Children office in Jalalabad, eastern Afghanistan. The gunmen stormed the building. For more than 8 hours, they battled Afghan security forces while dozens of Save the Children staff were trapped inside. The building was set on fire. Eventually, Afghan police and soldiers killed the attackers and rescued the staff. Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places for children to be born, following decades of war, insecurity, and poverty. For 12 years, Save the Children has worked with Afghan communities to help kids survive. But the attack on the agency's office in Jalalabad suggests it's becoming increasingly difficult for staff to help Afghans without becoming victims of the conflict themselves.
It's quite possible that Save the Children would leave Afghanistan, and the onus is on the Afghan government to provide security for them.
Latest statistics on aid worker security show that over the last 15 years, their jobs have become much more dangerous. In 2016, there were 158 attacks on aid organizations around the world, in which 101 aid workers were killed, 98 wounded, and 89 kidnapped. That's almost triple the number of attacks in 2003. South Sudan is the most dangerous country for aid workers, followed by Afghanistan and Syria. The UN humanitarian coordinator calls Afghanistan one of the most challenging and dangerous environments for humanitarians. In 2017, 17 aid workers were killed and 32 injured. Doctors Without Borders withdrew from the northern Afghan city of Kunduz in 2015 after the medical charity's hospital was mistakenly destroyed by a U.S. airstrike. And last year, the International Red Cross, which has operated in Afghanistan for more than 30 years, closed 2 clinics and limited its operations nationwide after 7 staff members were killed and others abducted.
Now we're in a very explosive situation, I think, where we know the communities can no longer guarantee our safety and our access. And that's now where it's becoming extremely difficult to know who we can rely on, and that's the challenge today, more so than in the last 30 years.
Afghanistan is dependent on aid organizations. If gunmen were to drive them out, the Afghan government can't support the social services programs on which millions of Afghans depend.
Save the Children says it helps 1.4 million children in Afghanistan, and it's committed to its work here. The organization would like to restart its programs, but it can only do so when it's sure its staff can work safely. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Let's bring in our guests. In Geneva, we have Francois Delflos. He is the project manager of attacks on hospitals with Doctors Without Borders, also known by its French initials MSF. Joining us via Skype from Juba is Marie Mortvet. She is the spokeswoman with the International Committee of the Red Cross in South Sudan. And finally, David Sedney. He's a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan and Pakistan and is now a Senior Fellow, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to you all. Now, Mari, I want to start with you. I often speak with aid workers in conflict zones who tell me about how much the situation is deteriorating, how much risk they face. Can you tell our viewers about how hard it is for you and your colleagues to operate out of a place like South Sudan?
Of course, when we work in a place like South Sudan, there's a risk. This is a country in war. It is a country where civilians are targeted every day. And for us as well here for the Red Cross, International Red Cross Committee here in South Sudan, we also lost one of our staff members in September last year. this was the most serious attack that we had seen on the ICRC in very many years here in South Sudan. And of course, this is something that we are very sad about, and something that we are affected by every day in our daily work here in South Sudan.
So, Maria, how hard is it for you on a personal level when you've lost friends and you've lost colleagues? You want to serve the needs of the most vulnerable, but you also realize that you and your colleagues are increasingly coming under attack.
I mean, when Kennedy, our ICRC staff member, was shot and killed in September last year, he was a South Sudanese that had been working with ICRC since 2014. When that happened, we could really see that the South Sudanese staff, as well as the international staff here in South Sudan, we really got together and we were shocked and saddened by what happened. This is something that reminded us about the vulnerable and fragile environment that we are working in. It, of course, is not something that should shock us too much. Of course, this can happen. We are working in a war and conflict environment here in South Sudan. But when this happened, we really saw that the South Sudanese colleague and the international colleague as well were supporting the family of the ICRC staff member that was killed when this happened.
David, what did the situation used to be like in places like Afghanistan for humanitarian workers, for aid groups? I mean, was it really safer for them 15, 20, 25 years ago to operate out of places like that?
It was somewhat safer in some areas, but attacks against aid workers in Afghanistan go back certainly for the 15 or so years that I've been involved. Attacks in 2002 and 2003 on ICRC and MSF groups that were working to help Afghanistan happened back then as well. But I think the number and severity of them have increased, as has the use of kidnappings. I spent the last year as president of the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul, and we have two professors who a year and a half ago were kidnapped by the Taliban, remained imprisoned by the Taliban, and so I believe it's a much more dangerous situation, certainly in Afghanistan now, than it was even 5 or 10 years ago.
Francois, picking up on what David said, one of the things that led to the UN Security Council Resolution 2286 being passed in 2016 was the destruction of the Doctors Without Borders hospital, the Kunduz Trauma Center. But hasn't violence against humanitarian groups only worsened since then?
I think we have to be, first I would like to highlight one thing, is that the violence against aid worker, humanitarian worker, is a symptom of the general violence that the civilian population in conflict zone are suffering from. So obviously we take account of our own staff being victim of attack, patients being victim of attack, but also the general population as also a direct victim of this level of violence. Second, I think it's difficult to say that there is an increasing trend for several reasons. First, the capacity to analyze the type of attack and the motivation behind. I think it's very contextual. In some country like Afghanistan, there is an increasing trend of, for instance, as mentioned, kidnapping. In other countries, it will be an increasing trend of aerial bombing against health facilities. It's very contextual. And one has to remind also that it's difficult to make comparison between epochs because nowadays there is a much bigger number of humanitarian workers being deployed worldwide than 20 years ago. So it's difficult to have to draw from that an attack rate, for instance. But I think what is important is that what we are facing, and therefore the UN Resolution 2286 you were mentioning, what we are facing is a new way to run warfare in an increasing number of contexts, namely Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. So you mentioned the Kunduz hospital bombing 3 years ago, but we did face increasingly a number of aerial bombing of healthcare facilities, whether it be intentionally as a tactic of war, whether it be unintentionally in the fog of war, as the US authorities told us regarding Kunduz hospital. And this new modern warfare, which is disrespectful of humanitarian aid as neutral, impartial, and independent type of aid, together with what we are afraid of is the criminalization also of humanitarian aid in the speech by state authorities. And I think it's very important for us, and therefore also I think it's a breakthrough that we were able to reach this UN resolution, despite the fact that it's not yet operationalized. That will be the next step for us. But the criminalization of humanitarian aid, basically criminalizing humanitarian aid being provided to a group labeled as criminal, labeled as terrorist, is a real burden to our capacity as organization to deploy independent, impartial, and neutral assistance where it's needed. And this is also eroding somehow the perceived neutrality and impartiality that we are seeking for, and we are relying on it for our own security.
Yeah. David, I want to ask you, when the United Nations and the Red Cross headquarters in Baghdad were destroyed just a few weeks apart in 2003, those events shocked the world. Today, these attacks on aid groups generate far fewer headlines. So has attacking a group like Save the Children gone from being unconscionable and unprecedented to being expected nowadays?
I wouldn't say it's gone to being accepted at all, and I think the reaction both in Afghanistan and around the world to attacks such as the one the other day on the Save the Children's remains strong. However, I think it really needs to be seen in the overall context of violence and violence against civilians around the world. 10 or 15 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, I think many people believed that the world was on the course to a better future, that attacks on civilians, that conflicts were going to be reduced. Sadly, as the horrible tragedy in Syria, the conflict there, the humanitarian disaster has shown, that's not the case. Human capacity for violence and cruelty has not abated. In fact, in some cases, in some areas, there's been a great deal of increase. So I think what we've seen is an overall increase in attacks and attacks against civilians, and as was just mentioned, often abetted by governments. So I think it's an overall trend. In Afghanistan specifically, I would note that in the year since 2014, when U.S. and NATO forces were withdrawn from combat, every year since then, the number of attacks on civilians have increased. So it's a situation there where the withdrawal of foreign forces didn't solve the problem. It actually appears to have made things worse.
So David, in your opinion, are there concrete steps that can be taken to reverse what some see as a very disturbing trend?
Well, I think the UN resolution you mentioned and the willingness of governments to actually enforce it could help. During this last 10 to 15 years, a number of governments around the world, the government of Pakistan, for example, the government of China, the government of Egypt and others, have spoken out very strongly against the activities of international NGOs and portrayed them as enemies of the country, enemies of the people. So I think that change in a number of countries to seeing NGOs as the enemy is part of an overall climate that some of these attacks flourish in. So I think working with those governments to reclaim that neutral space that aid and NGO agencies have around the world is very important, and I hope the UN resolution and the work of those who support it is successful.
Mari, how much of a threat do groups like yours face from non-state actors versus how much of a threat they face from state actors these days?
So I think you're asking an important question there, and it's in the discussion as well, of course. In the last years, in the last 6 years, we have seen more armed groups emerging globally than in the previous 6 decades. This is, of course, making our work as a neutral, independent, and humanitarian actor more complicated because it means that we will have to have dialogue with more parties to the conflict. It's a complex situation that we work in South Sudan, as well as very many other places in the world. And I think it's important as well for us as the ICRC to emphasize that this is not a new phenomenon. For the ICRC, we have been working in war and conflict areas for more than 150 years. And being, you know, on the front line is always challenging. It always has been. But I think what we have seen also here in South Sudan is that the front lines are now very much closer to where the civilians are actually living. This means that we also have to be very much closer to the front lines, because that's where we are to give humanitarian aid to the civilian population of South Sudan.
Francois, is one of the aspects of all this that international humanitarian law is simply being disregarded more by governments and by non-state actors?
Yeah, I think so. And I totally agree with my colleague from ICRC that it's not a new trend, but what we have witnessed recently, is a disrespect, an increasing disrespect in an increasing number of contexts of IHL. Therefore, the UN resolution is very important, but the UN resolution 2286 as such is meaningless if it's not enforced by states. So translating into domestic law, translating into war manual, and so on. So what we are fearing is that this resolution is just stay at this symbolic level, not being operationalized. But yes, definitely, what we see in Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, and so many other contexts is an increasing disregard by states for IHL in the conduct of war. The non-state actors are obviously also very much behind a number of violent attacks of different nature, looting of hospitals, and the key element is also our capacity as humanitarian workers to be able to engage with those non-state actors. In order to do so, the states who are conducting operation, counter-terrorism operation, for instance, need to acknowledge that it's also important for our own security and our capacity to run neutral and impartial activity in some context, to engage with those non-state actors, whether they be labeled as a terrorist group, criminal group, and things like this. It's very important for our own security that we are able and allowed to engage with those different non-state actors. And I agree that one of the element of context it's an increasing complexity with an increasing number of groups, an increasing number of complex ideology behind, and the capacity to engage with those different groups for humanitarian organization is a real key challenge.
Mari, one of the things I hear from lots of aid workers who work in conflict zones is that increasingly they have to take more measures for their security, for their colleagues' security. That means they have to go around with a much lower profile. In many cases, they can't wear the logos of the groups that they're working with, which would make them more identifiable. Does something like that mean that these groups might be regarded with more suspicion by locals? Because they think that these groups might have something to hide. Does that make the work even more difficult and more perilous?
I think I can only speak for the International Red Cross and our use of the emblem, which is basically our protection. And that's also very important for us to emphasize in this context, that we are, as a neutral, independent, and humanitarian actor, we are completely dependent on our emblem. We need our emblem for people to understand who we are, why we are there, and we need to be transparent when we speak to different parties of the conflict. And as I was saying, of course, this work is more extensive now. We have to have dialogue with more parties of more conflicts because of the complexity of different fractions inside the armed groups. But for us, the emblem is our definite protection. And we do gain that protection by talking about international humanitarian law and training armed groups as well as civilian population about the importance of having an actor like the ICRC presence so that we are able to give neutral and humanitarian assistance. This is why we are here, and that is what we are continuing to doing in the context also of South Sudan.
David, from your vantage point, what more can the international community do to protect humanitarian organizations?
Well, first, to actually apply the UN Security Council resolution, as the previous speaker mentioned. But beyond that, I think that making the case both to state actors and to non-state actors of the importance of protecting aid workers rather than using them as objects is something. And yes, it has been a problem for many years. It's not a new problem. But I do agree that it's getting worse, and I think that it's going to be a very difficult problem in the future. I don't know if there's going to be anything effective in the short term, but maybe in the longer term, outreach efforts can have some success.
Francois, what do you think about that? I mean, what steps do you see that can be taken in order to ensure safety for aid groups and for workers?
I think the main, on the long run, it's definitely this operationalization of UN Security Council resolution 2286. But on a day-to-day basis, when we are actually confronted with a threat and direct insecurity in our area of operation, it's really to be able to stick to our principle and really to be able to translate those principles into operation, which make sense, which are qualitative, which are not only perceived as neutral, impartial, and independent, but are also principled action, principled operation. I think the question you raised about identification, for instance, and getting low profile, I think this is, as such, I'm talking on behalf of MSF, obviously, it would be a dangerous trend. We have to really to be able to enforce these logos, acceptance of the logos, the identification of our principle and so on, and also to be very realistic and to draw a red line. If operating in an area means that we have to engage with non-state actors, for instance, and we are not able to engage with those non-state actors because they are not willing, because we are not in capacity to do the proper network, and so on. If we are not able to have a dialogue and a negotiation process with any warring party, whether they be state actor or non-state actor in a given context, we should take, and we did take the decision in some instance, not to work in this area. Because our main pillar for security is really the acceptance by the community and by the warring party. If we are not able to build that, we are not in capacity to work. So it's really a day-to-day negotiation. If a negotiation is deadlock, then we have to take sometimes a decision to withdraw and not to be operating there.
Mary, I'm going to give you the last word here. How do you balance all of this, the risks versus the drive to save lives, and what do you tell your colleagues operating there about how to go about doing their jobs in the most effective way?
Thank you for that last word. I think for us here in ICRC South Sudan, we really saw the bravery of our South Sudanese colleagues after what happened with our staff member here. Absolutely 100% impressed by the fact that they are willing to go back to the work that they have with the ICRC only the day after this happened. Of course, also an attack on an aid organization, any aid organization, is also an attack on the people that we are desperately trying to help. The humanitarian needs here in South Sudan are dire. People absolutely still need help from humanitarian aid organizations. And yeah, definitely, I think it's also important to remember that the vast majority of aid workers killed on a global scale are resident staff, local staff from the countries that they are from. And from the ICRC's point of view, we do not separate between South Sudanese and international staff. We have the same security rules for everybody, and our main objective is to continue the dialogue with the different parties of the conflict and absolutely make them understand our role as a neutral humanitarian and independent actor.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much to our guests, Francois Delfosse in Geneva, from Juba in South Sudan, Mari Mortvedt, and David Sedney from Washington, D.C. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.